I'm your host Helen Douthwaite Teasdale, and welcome to Brass Evolution, a show where we explore the rich culture and history of the brass banding world. This episode I'm chatting to David Hirst about the origins of probably the most famous brass band in the world, the Black Dyke Band. So welcome, David, to the podcast. For those who don't know you, could you give us a little introduction to yourself?
I started playing the cornet at the age of 9-10 in my local village band, Home Silver Band, who unfortunately no longer exists. When I was 14, I was invited to join the Yorkshire Imperial Metals Band with Trevor Worms, the conductor, who became a great friend of mine. I joined on the front row and went on the Repiano cornet. And then 2 years later, Jim Shepherd asked me to go up and audition at Black Dyke for the third cornet position, which I went up to, made a complete mess of it. Then at the interval, Jim says, "Do you fancy a go on soprano?" So I said, "Yeah, go on. I'll have a blow on the soprano." So I did so, and the band said, "Come back next week and have another go on soprano." So I came back for another 2 weeks after that, and then they said, "We'll sign you on as soprano cornet player." And I was 16 years old at the time, so I had some fantastic times with Black Dyke at that point. When Jim decided to leave in '74, I joined Versatile Brass for a while. And then because I was having tuition at Huddersfield University with Maurice Murphy and Ian Coole, respectively, then of the BBC Northern Symphony Orchestra, I started doing quite a lot of trumpet playing and specialised in D trumpet and obviously B flat trumpet as well, and spent a few years doing shows and things like that. Joined Brighouse for a short period, then joined Black Dyke again in 1978, did the Europeans and the Nationals with them. And then I thought, well, I'm going to go conducting. So I started conducting the local village band and gradually worked myself into the higher echelons, became conductor of a few bands. Then I started conducting Yorkshire Imperial for a while, went to Black Dyke as resident conductor for 2 years and joined Brighouse. And I was there for just around 11 years, and did a lot of great things with Brighouse. There's some wonderful people there, still some wonderful people, and the same at Black Dyke. And I did quite a lot of adjudicating here, there and everywhere. I eventually became a secretary of Black Dyke, which I did almost 4 years there. Thoroughly enjoyed it with Nicholas Childs and the rest of the band. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of orchestral trumpet playing.
From what you've just told me there, you've obviously got a very strong link going back to when you were, a young man with Black Dyke all the way through up until the present day, really. So how did you come about getting interested in the history of the band, and then obviously this leading into you writing your book?
Well, I think if you've ever, I'm not sure, Helen, have you ever been to the band room itself?
I have, yes.
Right, okay. Been upstairs to what is the Heritage Centre now.
Yeah.
That's a remake of the old band room. In fact, the old band room, which is like the upstairs of the current band, was demolished in 1978. There was quite a lot of structural problems with the building itself. Remember, it had been there before 1853, and as far as I remember, it was a coach house for John Foster's house, which was next door, Prospect House. So in '78, it was discovered there was lots of structural problems. It was completely demolished, and it was rebuilt exactly the same. It was in the same stone. The timbers were exactly the same inside. So then the specification of the rooms were exactly the same as well. But apart from that, when I first walked into the band room in 1969, there were all these pictures on the wall of all the old bandmasters, Phineas Bauer, and many, many more, Colonel Jaeger, and they were all there. And there was records of the band winning contests, even going back to the registration of the 1860 Crystal Palace with all the names and all the sort of work that these people did, the employment that they did in Foster's Mill. So for me, it was a fascinating experience, and I've actually never forgotten that. It's one of those things that I suppose, like many things in life, it stays with you and becomes an integral part of how you move your life forward. And in fact, if it wasn't due to me joining Black Dyke, I wouldn't have experienced a lot of things that I've experienced now. So I have a great respect for the band, a great respect for the history, and also a great respect for Foster's Mill, which no longer operates, unfortunately, but many of the buildings are still there, and a great respect for the people of Queensbury, because they supported the band from day one right up to the present day, and the people of Queensbury are still exceptionally interested in the band and keep up with what they're doing. So there's a fantastic history there. And obviously it dates back many decades, and all these different people who came and went have an important, or had an important, part to play in the history of the band. And therefore, it's like many other organisations, I suppose. There's that sort of linear history of it, but there's also the things that surround that, like the people who played in the band, the people who supported the band, obviously the people in the village of Queensbury itself, and all the different people who look up to the band. Because where I come from in West Yorkshire, Black Dyke was the band to play for. Not Brighouse, not Carlton Main, not Grimethorpe, but Black Dyke was the important band. And I suppose likewise in Lancashire, it could be Fairy Band or Foden's or other bands like that. But certainly every young person's dream at that point would be to play with Black Dyke.
You know, especially if you go walking into some of the older band halls, it's kind of like you've got all the plaques on the walls, the pictures, photographs, cups, trophies, you name it. It's kind of like ghosts of the past are on the walls, watching you and spurring you on a little bit. There's plenty of band halls like that in the UK for sure, I think.
That's quite right. And in some respects, like you go to the different contests. I mean, it'd been fascinating for me to have played at Crystal Palace. That was never a possibility, of course, but I was sort of happy enough to play at the Old Bellevue. I mean, that's where the contest started in 1853 at Bellevue. And you were playing on that stage, you could actually envisage, ingrained in the floorboards and everything else in the building, all these people who had gone before you, people like Phineas Bowers, Willie Heap and Cerise Jackson, all these famous names at that particular time. And it must have been a fascinating time for bandsmen, because I think we tend to look at some band players as being professionals. Well, that's not unique, because in the Victorian period, many players were actually professional players, and they actually signed contracts for a period of 1 year or 2 years. And if you look at the old copies of the Brass Band News, you'll see that many local bands would pay players. They would also obtain or offer jobs for them as well. And there was a fantastic amount of movement from one part of the country to another. In fact, Black Dyke brought a soprano player from Stoke-on-Trent to play with the band and found him a job, William Jasper. So it's actually a fascinating time, this sort of Victorian period where bands started relatively in the 1830s and grew to such an immense popularity by 1880, 1890. And unfortunately, I think due to the First World War and also the onset of different forms of music making, particularly jazz and what came after that, the bands began to decline.
The Black Dyke Band is probably the most famous or well-known band in the world. So let's just talk a little bit about the origins. They're quite humble origins to start off with. You could just give us a little bit of an idea of how the band first started.
Well, the band itself came from another band in Queensbury called the Queen's Head Band, because Queensbury used to be called Queen's Head. It was a staging point between Liverpool and Leeds, and the stagecoaches used to come up, and actually the stop-off point was the Old Dolphin and sometimes the Queen's Head, which was a pub as well, named after the village. Now, it was changed to Queensbury around about 1863, I think, by Royal Charter, but there was a band in Queensbury originally called the Queen's Head Band. Now, that went through several difficulties, and by the early 1850s, the band was on its last legs. Now, because John Foster was interested in brass playing, he was a French horn player, and he played with other people in the village who they were actually well-to-do people. A lot of people think that brass bands were formed by working-class people. That's impossible, isn't it? When you think about that, in the 1830s, how many working people who worked in the mill had the time or the... But in fact, if you remember that many people couldn't actually read or write, they wouldn't be able to afford a brass instrument to play on, would they? So I think from my research, I found out that many of these early brass bands were personnel by middle-class people or upper-class people as well. They were the only ones who could actually afford to do this and had the time to do it. So John Foster, seeing that this band was on its last legs, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to actually create something good for the village, he took over the Queen's Head Band and he signed all the players, or some of the players, because they brought players in, and I think they were probably professional players as well. They brought them in to the mill, to work at the mill, or let's say they said they worked at the mill.
Yeah.
Now, that's, I mean, we don't know, but there we are. And he formed the band in around about 1853, 1854. And he bought a set of instruments from Hyams in Manchester, who were a fantastic instrument maker at the time, and set the band up with a professional conductor, a resident conductor, rehearsal facilities, and uniforms, everything you could imagine. Because you've got to remember at that time that the mill, Dyke Mills, was actually in full operation at that time and growing rapidly until it reached really its height in the 1870s, 1880s, when it employed over 3,000 people. And it was a massive undertaking. John Foster owned most of the houses in Queensbury at the time. All the players were given houses, some very near the band room. The band room's in Sandbeds in Queensbury, right across from Victoria Hall, which where the band used to give concerts. And the band used to stay further down towards Bradford in a place called Scarlet Heights. And most of the players actually lived there. So this sort of Victorian benevolence, so the band reached great heights at that time.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, but because of the registration forms for that first Crystal Palace competition, we actually know the professions, names, and also the instrumentation.
That's right, yeah.
Could you just tell us a little bit about sort of the makeup or instrumentation of the first contest for the band?
Well, they played cornopians, which was a forerunner of the cornet. Initially, some were pitched in A flat. In fact, the pitches in general were quite fluid, I believe, at that time. And they played cornets in A flat. They played ophicleides, brass clarinets. I think they had a euphonium as well, and a couple of trombones. I think there was only about 12, 13, 14 players at that point in time, but that was quite common at that time, that bands were actually made up of different numbers and a whole host of different instruments as well. So we do know the makeup of the instruments themselves, and as I said, we know the names and the professions of these people.
Can you imagine in modern contesting if we had to put our professions and what make and model of instrument we were going to play on?
Well, it's actually not that long ago that you had to sort of put your name and address and everything else on there. I can remember doing that as a young boy in the local band, names and addresses and everything on the form. And I think if you go back before that, you'll find that there was a certain rule at one time that all the players for bands had to live in the same area. So what you get is a list of bandsmen who had number 1 Smith Street, number 2 Smith Street, number 3 Smith Street, number 4 Smith Street. So it was, it's like a lot of rules in banding. It's quite nonsensical. It never works, but there we are.
But the fact that we have this document that shows that it's a great part of the history of the band, that you can literally see every piece of information. It's just so interesting. And the keys of the instruments, the type of instruments, really useful.
Yeah, I think it is really, because in some ways, to me, we're sort of almost living in a vacuum with banding at the moment, because I think we were all glad about John Gladney's idea when he conducted the Meltham Mills band in the 1870s, that he standardised the brass band format, same number of cornets, same number of horns, etc., etc. But in some ways, by doing that, we've lost that sort of way of making the same piece sound entirely different. Can you just imagine now if we go back in the old days, where you had a second cornet and a second flugel, a third cornet and a third flugel, another flugel that led the horns, 4 horns like they used to have, and perhaps the introduction of an ophicleide now, or a piccolo trumpet, or why do we have to have the same format? It's almost like it's fixed in time, and because music publishers have had to sort of conform to this standardization, then everybody is actually fixed like glue and can't make any changes.
At that first Crystal Palace contest, you would have probably heard, depending on how many bands competed, 50 different versions of the same piece, because of the completely different instrumentation of every band.
Yeah, that's right. And do remember that in those days you were given a piece of music, and the bandmasters at that time would rearrange that music for their own combination. So again, you've got slightly different things there. You're sort of judging different elements. But the concept of adjudicating it is always the same. It's that holistic approach to listening from beginning to end and making a musical judgment. So the fact that it was a slightly different combination shouldn't really make any difference. But fascinating if we actually got to that stage where we could introduce different instruments. It'll never happen.
No. I think we're too far down the road now, I'm afraid. Unless anyone wants to introduce an ophicleide into the modern brass band contest.
Well, there is a movement to actually begin playing these, and there are several people who are beginning to. I think Wessex manufacture an ophicleide as well, and several other people have done so.
Yeah. In one of my previous episodes, we were talking about the G trombone.
Oh, fantastic.
And the use of the G trombone in the modern context. And go have a listen to that episode, everyone. But some people did want to play on a G trombone in the 90s. Can you imagine?
I mean, it is actually a unique sound, and played correctly, it is a wonderful instrument and worth thinking about. I think I remember 2 specialists in my youth, Ken Sarsby, who played for Brighouse, and Derek Roebuck, who also played for Brighouse at one point. They were also superstars in the G trombone. And remember that, for those who don't know, they used to have a handle on it so you could reach 7th position. And the expert G trombonist used to throw the handle, let go of it, and catch it again as you got to the 7th position. It was a fascinating thing to watch, and a wonderful thing to hear as well.
Yeah, quite a unique instrument. And obviously all of these, like brass clarinets, cornopians, very distinct sounds, quite a little bit different to what our modern brass band sounds like today.
Yeah, it's a pity we don't have recordings, but...
I know, if only. That leads quite nicely on when you were talking about the bandmasters arranging the set test piece for their own instrumentation.
Yeah.
So can we just talk a little bit about Frank Galloway and his arrangements of part books, which still exist in the Black Dyke archives?
Yes, they do. And they're fascinating historical documents, in fact, because it tells us a lot about the players at that time, and some of the music is quite difficult. It is quite difficult, and it tells us that their expertise then was probably just as equally as good as it is now. And the part books themselves We're never quite sure about whether Frank Galloway actually wrote them or not, because there is a story that he bought them from a military band in Manchester. Now, we can't obviously we can't tell the truth of that, but they are scored for the instrumentation of the time, and all the part books are actually aligned to more or less the combination of the Crystal Palace band in the 1860s. Now, Black Dyke have recorded a lot of these on some heritage CDs, which I think are still for sale. Actually, so.
I'll put the link to the Black Dyke website. Don't worry, I couldn't possibly leave that part out. So yes, I will. No. I will put links to all of the things that we mentioned today.
But they are interesting, and the other interesting part about the part books is the fact that on the front they're printed as the Black Dyke Mills Military Band. Now, if you look at the photograph taken in the early 1860s, you'll see that the band actually looked very much like a military combination. And I think, again, if you remember back at that time, Britain was under the threat from the French again. And there was a great deal of volunteer regiments formed. Now, the Fosters were part of those volunteer regiments, and they were often officers, that's Colonel Foster and others. They had their own military band as well. Now, I suspect, and I've tried to find the proof of this, and I can't, I suspect that Black Dyke Mills Band was part of their regimental band at one time, and hence the look of the uniforms at that point in time. So I think that I'm not going to say there's strong evidence, but my belief is that Fosters used the band for their military processions and everything else like that.
Yeah, I was going to say that part of the book does ring very true, because a lot of existing brass bands in that time period then moved into a sort of volunteer role.
That's right.
And then proceeded to become, some became more wind bands, some stuck to the true brass roots, and then they post this era, they went back into the.
They did, yeah. Once the threat from France was finished, the volunteer movement disappeared, and I think the one reason that bands became volunteer bands was for one reason only: the money.
Absolutely. I mean, where opportunity knocks, David, you've got
Nothing changes.
You touched there briefly on the uniforms. So we, in the modern era, think of Black Dyke as the red, the black, and the gold. What colour was? What do we know? What colour the first uniforms were for this kind of band?
The first proper uniforms are green.
Quite different.
With a white belt across the front, and obviously a hat with all the plumes and things. In fact, there's one of the hats in the band room, less the plume, of course, but in the Heritage Centre, there's one of the hats there which dates back to that particular time. And uniforms are all based on military designs, right up until the end of the 19th century, when the government passed a law that only the forces at that time, most the army, of course, could wear military-style uniforms. Brass bands had to slightly adapt their uniforms so they didn't look as though they were actually military uniforms at that time. So right from the early days, most brass bands used to model their uniforms on military styles. And the multitude of uniform manufacturers did the same. In fact, in Huddersfield alone, there were 3 massive uniform manufacturers: James Beaver's and Hodgson's, and I can't remember the third one there, but every town appeared, certainly the textile areas, appeared to have uniform manufacturers.
So interesting. It kind of just shows you the sort of vast number of bands and other organisations that were acquiring that sort of at the time. Every village, every town, every city seemed to have a band at that point in time, and so they were quite prolific then. I mean, some would go for 3 or 4 years and then sort of disband, but really there was thousands of bands, and you've got to remember that a whole industry grew up
from that. And not only instrument manufacturers, but uniform manufacturers, music stand manufacturers, music printing, valve oil makers, all these sort of things. People were selling lip balm to enable you to play for longer and longer and longer.
Where do I get some of that?
Well, I mean, the whole list is fascinating. Then you've got the growth of the professional players who advertised in the band press, the professional conductors, people like Owen and Gladney, and many, many more. You know, the whole thing ballooned really towards the end of the 19th century, and became a whole industry itself. I mean, you've got examples of John Gladney going to America to work there, Alexander Owen, who went on several trips to Australia and around the world trips, and it's difficult to believe now that they actually did that in that day and age when they were on sort of sailing ships rather than steamships. Really, it's I mean, the whole thing was sort of almost based on a fully professional basis, and certainly I think if people went back in time now, they'd be absolutely fascinated with how ingrained banding was, not just for the people who were playing in it and associated with, but the general public as well. Because you have examples of 8,000 people attending the Bellevue contest, and also thousands of people attending park jobs at that time.
In one of the episodes, we talked about Bessie's going over to Australia doing world tours, and there'll be literally thousands of people coming out to see them. Just right. On a scale we just can't quite comprehend now in the modern era, I don't think.
No, there were stars. It was unbelievable, really. I mean, Fordens went to South Africa for a period at the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
It's difficult to believe now. We think that this going abroad bands going abroad is a new thing from the 1970s. It certainly isn't.
Can we talk a little bit about some of the local rivalries that were going on between Black Dyke and others, and also a little bit of correspondence between two individuals who went under aliases? So we had Trottermus Trotter
That's the one,
and Pondash. Could you just give us a little bit of a feeling about, you said that, they were superstars, people were getting shipped in left, right and centre to play for the bands. What was going on in terms of the rivalries just there?
Well, in some respects, we talk about brass band media now on Facebook and things, but there was brass band media then, and the same sort of principles almost applied. You've got this rivalry between two particular bands towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and that was Black Dyke and Bessers of the Barn. Now, Bessers were conducted by Alex Owen, who used to conduct Black Dyke, so there was a little bit of sort of fierce rivalry there, because Owen had to resign from Black Dyke because of a contradiction on a contest, because he wanted to play with Bessers on the same contest as Black Dyke. Now there was some controversy about that, and it really forced Alex Owen to resign. So there's a little bit of almost bad blood between the bands from a fairly early stage. Now in the brand press itself, a lot of people corresponded and wrote sort of all sorts of things which weren't always kind to other bands, in actual fact. But the thing about it then is that they used to write all these under pen names or pseudonyms. Now, Bessers' supporter, and Stephen Hughes from Bessers is quite an expert in Bessers' history, and he's tried to find out who this Trottermus is. Now, this Bessers sort of fan signed himself as Trotter or Trotterus. That may have been one or two people, I'm not sure, but he was always making snide comments about Black Dyke and how they weren't as good as Bessers and everything else like that. And the other one, the Black Dyke fan, was called John Wilson. We know that because we found that out, that John Wilson, he was Pondash. Now, we talk about Pondashers as being supporters of Black Dyke, but Pondash was John Wilson's pen name. And so after a period of time, everybody who supported John Wilson and these attacks on Bessers were then called Pondashers. So that's where the idea comes from. But if you go back to the old copies of the Brass Band News, and they're available on Salford University's website, then it's fascinating to read through all these different sort of attacks and re-attacks, and they are said with tongue in cheek often, so they're not sort of vile things like you get today, I must admit. But it is quite interesting.
It's kind of like pre-social media age. This is just kind of, commenting in the, in the paper and all this sort of thing. It's very fun.
It's more interesting, actually. I'd advise anybody to try and find these, because Roy Newsom actually scanned all these while he was at Salford University, and they are available online. Fascinating reading. It really is fascinating reading.
What's one of the most interesting discoveries you've made when you were writing the book and researching the history of the band?
I think it's the names of people, because these people are long forgotten, aren't they, really? I mean, one thing that I remember when I was first at Black Dyke was that we had a gentleman who was the caretaker of the band room. He used to come and clean the band room. It was a filthy place, I have to say. It's steeped in history and everything, but it was still. He used to come and clean the band room and make sure it was okay for the rehearsals. And he used to keep the keys, so if you were there early before anybody else, you could call at Herman Ambler's house and get it. Now, I think the interesting thing for me, because we never really thought of him as anybody else, but just a support of the band. And perhaps we didn't take him as serious as we should have done in many respects. But on researching the book, I found that he has a long history with his family, is the Ambler family with Black Dyke, because they played, his ancestors played in Black Dyke from the early days. In fact, one interesting thing I found out was one of his relatives, called Phineas Ambler, who was the first baritone player towards the latter part, about 1870 onwards. When he left the band, he became the resident conductor of the Corey band. And the same with the band's principal euphonium player from the 1880s. Once he left the band, John Bailey, he took over from Phineas Ambler as resident conductor of Corey as well. So it's thanks to Black Dyke that Corey band are where they are today.
I'm gonna get some direct messages, I'm sure. It's just fascinating, and the book goes into great detail about the social history as well as the musical history of the band. Yeah. Where can people find out more about the book and yourself, David?
Well, it's available from Kirklees Music in Brighouse. Graham Horsfield, whose father played rep piano next to me in Black Dyke. Graham has some copies of the book there, and people can order from there. It's a brilliant read, honestly.
It's got some really great sort of photographs and also some like artifacts and mementos from the actual Black Dyke archives. You can see all of the copies of the part books and all of the sort of trophies, etc. So really worth a little read. David, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating. We could talk for hours about the Black Dyke band, but we're just going to stick to this tiny little Victorian section for now. Thank you again.
Yeah, good to talk to you.
If you like the podcast, please help to grow by liking, sharing, rating and reviewing. You can also support the podcast by leaving a tip or buying a perk, including asking my next guest a question or getting a shout out via Pod Inbox, links in the show notes. Podcast music is Mephistopheles, performed by the Illinois Brass Band.